Imagine standing on the shores of a distant land, somewhere in the 1400s. Feel the wind brushing against your face, the salty ocean air filling your lungs. The weight of the unknown is heavy in the air, and you're standing on the edge of something that will forever change history. For centuries, the seas had kept continents isolated, separated, and mysterious. But by the 1400s, that began to change. The world was on the brink of transformation, and a new kind of trade was about to begin, a trade that would forever alter the course of history. But this wasn't a trade of spices, gold, or luxury goods. No, this was something darker, more sinister. The story of how this trade began is more complex and disturbing than we could ever imagine, but it's a story we must understand, a story that touches every part of the world and continues to shape our lives today. This is the beginning of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a dark chapter that led to the suffering and exploitation of millions of people. In the 1400s, Portuguese explorers, led by figures like Prince Henry the Navigator, set their sights on uncharted waters along the African coast. The seas were no longer a barrier. These sailors had a mission, but it wasn't about discovering new lands or wealth in the usual sense. No, they were after something far more valuable: control over a system of trade that would one day span continents and enslave millions. As the Portuguese sailed further down Africa's coast, they discovered something that would change the course of history forever: human beings captured, sold, and traded. But slavery wasn't a new concept. African societies had been involved in various forms of servitude for centuries, often as part of local conflicts, wars, or tribal rivalries. But the Portuguese saw an opportunity for something bigger, something much more profitable. The Portuguese didn't create slavery, they expanded it. They didn't want ivory, gold, or spices anymore. They wanted enslaved Africans who could be shipped across the ocean to work on sugar plantations in the Americas. Labor was in high demand for the growing global need for sugar. It was a new kind of economy built on human misery. At first, it wasn't about force. The Portuguese struck deals with local African leaders, exchanging goods for enslaved people. These individuals weren't kidnapped in the way we think of today. They were often prisoners of war or those caught in local conflicts. The Portuguese didn't seek to free them. They saw only profit. Goods like weapons, textiles, and other valuable items were traded for humans, turning lives into commodities. By the time the 1500s rolled around, Portugal had set up forts and trading posts all along the African coast. Places like Elmina Castle became infamous. These forts weren't places of refuge. No, they were sites where enslaved people were held in appalling conditions before being loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. They were gates to a living hell. But this was just the beginning, just the spark. This system began to grow. The Portuguese laid the foundation for a trade network that would soon include other European nations: Spain, France, Britain, and the Netherlands. What started as isolated voyages turned into an interconnected global system, which we now call the triangular trade. This wasn't just one nation or one journey. It was a web of exploitation that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in ways that had never been seen before. Imagine the process. Ships left Europe carrying goods like cloth, guns, and rum. When they reached Africa, those goods were traded for enslaved Africans. These Africans were then forced onto ships for a brutal journey across the Atlantic. The ships made their way to the Americas, where enslaved people were sold at auction, commodified, reduced to nothing more than property. In return, the ships returned to Europe, filled with sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and other goods. And just like that, the triangle was complete, a cycle that was highly profitable, but built on the suffering of millions. These enslaved people worked in sugar plantations, tobacco fields, and cotton farms, building the wealth of the Americas. Their lives were marked by pain, suffering, and loss. Their families were torn apart, but it doesn't end there. The journey across the Atlantic was called the Middle Passage, and it was nothing short of horrific. The journey was long, sometimes months long. Conditions were so brutal that many didn't survive. Disease, malnutrition, and overcrowding were rampant. People were packed like cargo, chained together, barely able to move or breathe. Some estimates say that up to 2 million Africans perished during this journey. These weren't just numbers, these were lives lost, families destroyed, cultures wiped out. When the ships finally reached the Americas, they docked in places like the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American colonies. Here, the enslaved people were sold at auction. Their pain didn't end there. It was only just beginning. They worked in the fields, day in and day out. For many, this would be the end of their story, but for their descendants, the scars of the transatlantic slave trade would remain forever. This wasn't just about the Americas or Africa. This system changed the entire world. It connected continents, economies, and industries in ways that had never been seen before. But in the midst of this system, millions of Africans were exploited, dehumanized, worked to death. It wasn't just an economic system, it was a violent, brutal, and exploitative system that defined the lives of millions. Today, the descendants of those enslaved Africans live on in the Americas. Their culture, music, art, and traditions have shaped modern society. But the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade isn't just in their stories. It's in the structural inequalities that continue to affect people of African descent all around the world. In Europe, the profits from the transatlantic slave trade fueled industrialization. The goods produced on the backs of enslaved Africans, such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco, were traded, sold, and consumed across the globe. Europe grew wealthier and more powerful. But this wealth came at an unimaginable cost. As time went on, not everyone supported the system. Abolition movements began to gain traction. People in Europe and the Americas started to question the morality of slavery. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Wilberforce began to shift public opinion, calling for an end to this inhumane system that had been in place for centuries. By the 1800s, abolitionists had pushed through laws that slowly began to dismantle the transatlantic slave trade. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1907, followed by the United States in 1808. But even after the laws changed, the repercussions of the slave trade were far from over. The descendants of the enslaved, especially in the Americas, continued to grapple with the aftermath. The impact of the slave trade is still felt today. It's in the fight for racial justice and equality. It's on the long road to healing. But we must remember this history if we are ever going to move forward. The story of the transatlantic slave trade isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's about understanding how this history still affects us today and the work that remains to heal the wounds of centuries of exploitation. We must learn from this dark chapter, not just to remember who suffered, but to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe to stay informed on this and other crucial histories. Together, we can continue learning, growing, and working towards a more just world.